You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, and it includes 4 different sites showcasing.
There is a postcard version of Lake Tahoe that most people know. The turquoise water, the pine-covered mountains framing every horizon, the kind of clarity that makes you feel like you are looking through glass rather than water. It is real. It is genuinely that beautiful, and for generations, that beauty was the whole story. But beauty has always been a surface thing. And in 2024, when a historic drought pulled the surface down, what waited underneath changed the story entirely. This is not a legend. This is not folklore dug up from some campfire rumor. This is what scientists, divers, and remotely operated cameras actually documented when Lake Tahoe's water receded and the world beneath it finally came into the light. To understand what was found, you first have to understand what Lake Tahoe actually is. Beneath its famous blue surface, the lake sits at an elevation of 6,225 feet, straddling the California-Nevada border. It is the largest alpine lake in all of North America and the second deepest lake in the entire United States. Only Crater Lake in Oregon beats it for depth. The basin itself was carved by geological faulting millions of years ago, creating a trench that plunges to 1,645 feet at its deepest point. The water temperature at those depths hovers just above freezing year-round, cold enough to be dangerous to any diver, cold enough to slow decay to almost nothing, cold enough to preserve whatever sinks there for a very, very long time. The lake's famous clarity, the thing that fills every photograph and tourism brochure, actually comes from an absence. There is almost nothing living in the deep water. The granite basin contributes almost no nutrients. The cold suppresses biological activity. The result is water so clear that from the surface, on a calm day, you can see nearly 70 feet straight down. The Tahoe Environmental Research Center, known as TERC, has been tracking that clarity with a white measurement disc called a Secchi disc every year since 1968, and the 2024 annual average came in at 62.3 feet. Still remarkable. Still unlike almost any other water body in the country. But there is a side to that geology and chemistry that the brochures leave out. Drop something past 1,500 feet in Lake Tahoe, and you are not really dropping it into a lake. You are placing it inside a cold, dark, pressurized vault where decomposition barely functions, where gases stay locked in solution, where light-driven chemistry cannot reach, and where nothing natural will bring it back up for decades. The same properties that make Lake Tahoe one of the clearest bodies of water on Earth also make it one of the most effective places on Earth to hide something permanently. Or so people once believed. The story of what was found at the bottom of Lake Tahoe really begins not in the water but on land in the 2 decades following World War II. Before the war, Lake Tahoe was genuinely remote. Roads were difficult and often impassable in winter. The area attracted a small number of wealthy visitors willing to make the journey, but it remained largely undeveloped and wild. The war changed that calculation in a fundamental way. Military infrastructure improved the regional roads. Soldiers stationed nearby discovered the area. And when the war ended and those veterans came home with money, cars, and a desire to enjoy the country they had fought for, they remembered Tahoe. The development boom that followed in the late 1940s and into the 1950s was rapid and largely unregulated. The Nevada side of the lake offered legal gambling, and casinos began rising along the South Shore. Hotels, motels, restaurants, and residential cabins multiplied across both states. The population of the basin grew faster than anyone had planned for, and faster than any environmental framework existed to manage. All of that construction and all of those new businesses generated enormous quantities of waste, construction debris, industrial solvents, chemicals from the automotive shops, dry cleaning facilities, laundry services, and photography processing labs that supported the growing casino economy. old vehicles, equipment that had outlived its usefulness. In the 1950s, proper hazardous waste disposal was expensive, largely unregulated, and in many cases legally optional. Lake Tahoe was right there, seemingly bottomless, free to use, and deep enough that nobody was ever going to check. So things went into the lake, quietly, regularly, over years, and then decades. The visible surface stayed blue. The clarity measurements stayed high. Whatever was dumped sank out of sight, and out of sight meant out of concern. For environmental regulators, for local officials, for the tourism industry, and for the companies whose waste had disappeared into those depths, the lake had done its job. That calculation held for nearly 70 years. The drought that arrived in 2024 was not a small or ordinary thing. It was the culmination of years of below-average snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, a mountain range that supplies the lake through seasonal melt and runoff. Evaporation exceeded inflow, and the lake level began dropping. By summer 2024, it had fallen approximately 9 feet from its average level. 9 feet sounds modest for a lake nearly 1,645 feet deep, but the 9 feet happened at the shoreline. And along the shoreline, that 9 feet of exposed lakebed revealed things that had not seen daylight in a very long time. Hikers and beachgoers walking on newly uncovered ground reported unusual finds almost immediately. Corroded metal objects, old tires, bottles from eras long past, easy to dismiss as scattered litter. Then the divers arrived. Colin West is the founder and executive director of Clean Up the Lake, a nonprofit organization based in the Tahoe Basin whose work has focused on recovering submerged litter from the lake's underwater shoreline. The organization's flagship project was the first ever human-powered circumnavigation of Lake Tahoe using scuba equipment, working to depths of roughly 35 to 55 feet. By the conclusion of that effort, the dive team had collected nearly 25,000 pieces of litter from the lake, removing over 25,000 pounds of submerged trash from Tahoe's waters. Items recovered included not just bottles and cans, but engine blocks, lampposts, even engagement rings that had slipped off fingers decades ago and settled into the silt below. With the drought exposing sections of the lakebed that had been unreachable for divers operating within safe recreational limits, West's teams began working in zones that were suddenly, unexpectedly accessible. What they found there was different from what they had been pulling out of the shallows. Vehicles, dozens of them. Cars and trucks from the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s positioned near old road access points and cliff edges along the perimeter. Some appeared to have rolled or been driven in deliberately. Others had clearly been pushed. And the condition of these vehicles was the detail that kept coming up in every account from everyone who saw them. The cold water, the same cold that suppresses all biological activity and maintains the lake's famous clarity, had slowed the corrosion that destroys submerged metal in warmer environments. Paint was still visible on some of the vehicles. Dashboard features remained recognizable. On a handful, license plates were still legible. These were not wrecks dissolved into abstraction by decades underwater. They looked, by multiple first-hand accounts, disturbingly recent. The survey effort expanded beyond what scuba divers could safely manage. For depths below a few hundred feet, the teams brought in remotely operated vehicles, ROVs equipped with high-definition cameras, powerful lights, and tethers long enough to reach the bottom of the basin. ROV operators exploring Tahoe's depths have consistently reported unexpected discoveries on every single dive, including boats without registration numbers whose age remains uncertain, and fish at depths where scientists did not initially expect to find them. The lake has a way of revealing surprises to anyone willing to look closely. What the ROV cameras found at intermediate depths, from 200 to 500 feet, was more of what the divers had encountered above. Debris, old vehicles, evidence of disposal events spread across years. Then the surveys pushed deeper. Below 1,000 feet, the ROV entered a fundamentally different environment. Sunlight was gone entirely. The temperature had dropped to the low 40s and stayed there. The pressure was at levels that would crush an unprotected human being, and the debris continued. At around 1,400 feet, the cameras illuminated something the team had not expected. Industrial barrels, large cylindrical containers of the kind used to transport and store chemicals, not one or two, but dozens scattered across the lakebed. Then, the camera turned and there were more. Then more beyond those, fading out into the darkness beyond the reach of the lights. The distribution told a story. Some barrels had been dropped in clusters, suggesting organized disposal events. Others were spread out individually, as if dropped on separate occasions over months or years. Some had clearly been full when they sank. The pattern across the survey area strongly suggested not a single incident, but a sustained practice, repeated over an extended period of time. Divers and remotely operated vehicles probing the lake's extreme depths encountered hundreds of corroded industrial barrels leaking toxic heavy metals, abandoned vehicles frozen in time, and other eerie artifacts that suggest Lake Tahoe was used as a hidden dumping ground for decades. Industrial drums do not arrive at 1,400 feet by accident. They do not fall off boats. They do not roll into the water on their own. Someone transported them to the lake and deposited them in water deep enough that no instrument of that era could have found them again. The depth was the disposal plan. At approximately 1,600 feet, near the operational limit of the ROV surveys, the barrels changed character. They were larger and more heavily constructed than the ones above, and they were not merely corroded. They were actively leaking. The cameras captured visible plumes of material seeping from ruptured containers, spreading into the surrounding water column in slow, drifting clouds that the cold and stillness of the deep lake held together rather than dispersing. Water samples taken near these containers and analyzed at the Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center came back with results that no one wanted to see. Heavy metals at concentrations far exceeding safe levels. Lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic. Industrial solvents that had been banned under federal environmental law decades ago. The contents of those barrels matched the industries that had been most active in the Tahoe Basin during the post-war development period. Metal processing operations, automotive services, dry cleaning and commercial laundry facilities serving the casino hotels, photography processing labs, paint and coating manufacturers. All of these operations generate hazardous chemical waste. In the 1950s, the cheapest and easiest way to dispose of it was to make it disappear, and Lake Tahoe was the disappearing act. The Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center has been tracking water clarity and other health indicators at Lake Tahoe since 1968. Turk's documentation of clarity loss during the 1950s and 1960s became central to early efforts to protect the watershed from pollution and unplanned development. The 2024 annual clarity report from Turk documents steep declines through the 1990s that have since leveled off. In 2024, annual average clarity was measured at 62.3 feet. The question that has quietly troubled researchers for years is not simply whether the number is going up or down, but why the plateau exists at all. Why, after decades of environmental protection and heavily regulated development, has clarity failed to meaningfully recover? The deep water discoveries offer one possible answer. Contamination that has been sitting in sealed and then slowly corroding containers for 70 years does not stay put indefinitely. Metal fails, seals break, and the trace amounts of heavy metals found at shallower depths than the barrels should reach suggest that what was locked in the deep is not staying there. It is migrating upward through the water column, slowly, invisibly, in concentrations too diffuse to trigger standard monitoring, but present nonetheless. Researchers at Turk have noted that fine particles in the upper waters are the primary factor governing lake clarity, and they have begun examining decades of data on potential drivers of clarity changes to better understand which factors shift from year to year. The relationship between deep water contamination and surface clarity is a research question that has taken on new urgency since the ROV surveys. The timeline that researchers have pieced together places the heaviest dumping between roughly 1948 and 1965. This corresponds precisely with the casino development boom and the broader post-war construction surge. The chemicals match the industries. The geography matches the access points. The depth corresponds to where the water was simply too far down for anyone at the time to investigate. Every piece of evidence fits the same conclusion. There is a category of discovery from the deep water surveys that is more difficult to discuss and more difficult to confirm, and it is worth being careful about what is established fact versus what has been reported on background by people who were there. Lake Tahoe has carried a particular local legend for decades. The casino era that drove the development boom also brought organized crime to the Tahoe-Reno corridor. Criminal enterprises disputed territory. Disputes were resolved through violence, and the legend, passed down in the region for generations, holds that victims of that violence were disposed of in the lake, in waters deep enough that they would never be recovered and never be found. The cold that prevents biological decay was supposed to preserve them indefinitely. The depth was supposed to make recovery impossible. Urban legends of dozens or even hundreds of bodies, some whispered to be victims of mob activity from Reno's past, have circulated for decades, and the latest discoveries have given them fresh life. What is known is this: portions of the deep water ROV footage have not been publicly released. Relevant agencies have confirmed that the footage is under active review. What people who were present on the research boats have said, in conversations with reporters from regional news outlets, is that the ROV cameras encountered what appeared to be human remains in multiple locations along the deep basin floor. The same cold that preserved the barrels, the same chemistry that kept those 1950s automobiles recognizable, appears to have done the same to whatever else was placed in those depths. No formal conclusions have been released. The investigation is ongoing, but the physical conditions that would be required for long-term preservation of organic material in the deep lake are unquestionably present, and they have been confirmed by everything else the surveys found. Here is where the story becomes genuinely complicated, and where the people who know it best are most candid about their uncertainty. The environmental contamination is not a theoretical risk. It is a documented, ongoing, slow-motion release of toxic materials into a water body that supplies downstream communities, supports a recreational fishing industry, and hosts millions of visitors each year. Heavy metals do not break down. They do not disappear. Lead is lead whether it was poured into a barrel in 1952 or whether it is drifting through the water column in 2024. But remediation presents its own set of serious problems. The barrels are at depths that are difficult and expensive to work at safely. They have been sitting undisturbed for decades, and the corrosion that has already compromised their integrity means that attempting to raise them physically could rupture containers that are currently only slowly leaking, triggering a far more significant release than the one currently occurring. Some researchers advocate for a monitoring approach, document the contamination, track its spread, and avoid disturbing containers whose contents are currently migrating out slowly rather than all at once. Others argue that leaving known toxic waste in an iconic American lake is an unacceptable position regardless of the logistical complexity. Clean Up the Lake has continued conducting deep dive surveys to explore litter at greater depths and identify new hotspots that require attention. To date, the organization has removed over 33,000 pounds of trash from Lake Tahoe, but the barrels that the ROVs found in the deep basin are a different scale of problem from the debris that dive teams have been recovering from the shallows. They represent a disposal operation that was industrial in size and deliberate in intent. And cleaning them up will require resources and technology that no nonprofit organization can provide alone. State and federal agencies have begun organizing working groups. Studies have been commissioned. Funding requests are moving through bureaucratic channels. The California State Water Resources Control Board and the EPA's regional offices are aware of the findings. But awareness and action are different things, and the barrels keep leaking while the conversations continue.